So, several months ago, I put out a video detailing the shortcomings of the Remington 700 Walker trigger, and it got a lot of feedback on that video, a lot of comments, and a lot of questions. So, I decided to do a video of just going through the process of unitizing the trigger and the connector as I detailed in that previous video. So what I have here is I have a Remington 700 BDL 30-06. This rifle, to the best of my knowledge, is unfired. This is 1974 production. 700 BDL. I bought it off a gun broker. I bought it a few years back. Came with the box. It came with a leather sling in the box, which is kind of neat. I really didn't know that the 700s came with slings back then, but at least the BDLs, apparently Remington included a leather sling. So that was pretty neat. You know, I'm a big Remington 700 fan, and I haven't shot this rifle yet. Like I said, to the best of my knowledge, it's unfired. I don't see any marks on the bolt face or anything. But at any rate, I hadn't fixed the trigger on this one yet, and I thought, well, it'd be a good opportunity to kind of make a video for beginning to end, showing the steps in the process. For those of you that have had questions about how I do this. So another thing that I think I will address, since I'm making this video, I stated in the other video, and I had a couple questions on it, about why I prefer the older bolt lock safeties, and I'll just demonstrate that. So this is 1974 production. The Remington 700s from 1962, when the 700s were introduced, and the prior Remingtons, the 721, 722, 725, so forth, when the safety was on safe, it locked the bolt. So as you can see, safety on, bolts locked shut. This is a preference of mine. Pretty much any serious hunting rifle of mine will lock the bolt shut when it's on safe. Remington in 1982 changed their safety so that it no longer locked the bolt. This change was in response to their trigger problems. Folks were having discharges. They would flip the safety onto fire so they could unload the rifle, and they were having some discharges. I think there was a fatality or two. So instead of fixing the trigger problem that Remingtons have been known for, the Walker trigger, what Remington did is they deleted the bolt locking feature on their safety. So that change happened in 1982. I swap in the older safeties on my newer Remington 700, so they still have that bolt lock feature. So in my mind, it's kind of a shame that Remington went away from that. For a hunting rifle, I prefer the bolts lock forward. For the main reason is so that if you're walking through brush and so forth, so that the bolt handle doesn't come open. If a bolt handle comes partially open, you'll have a misfire. If you get a shot at game, the energy of the striker has to close the bolt prior to igniting the primer, and you have a misfire. And I know several hunters that has happened to. I'll demonstrate that right here. It's not something I like to do a lot, but if the bolt's lifted a little bit, and if I try to shoot, just watch what happens. See that bolt dropped? that's the energy of the striker is used up to close the bolt. The result of that would be a misfire, a mischance at game. If you're hunting something that has a capability of biting back, it could be a lot worse than not getting a shot at game, obviously. So that's the main reason I like the bolts to lock shut when the safety's on. Avoid that happening. Also, I've hunted on horseback, and the scabbard that I was using, it had a leather flap that attached around the bolt handle. Well, if the bolt handle won't stay locked shut, the bolt would just ride up and would come open, and the rifle was no longer secure in the scabbard. So anyhow, just I thought I'd answer that question. I greatly prefer a bolt that locks shut. So anyhow, without any further, I'll get started here and I'll show exactly what I do to correct this trigger issue. To start with, I've got to disassemble the rifle. I'm going to go ahead and remove the bolt. We'll just set that aside. Kind of a side note, I was surprised how light this rifle was. Like I said, it was new in the box, 1974 production. It was really light. I threw it on a scale the other day. This actually weighs less than 7 pounds. It was, I think, 6 pounds, 14 ounces. Nice light rifle. I think the newer ones tend to weigh a little bit more than that, but it could be just the wood that was on this one. Not sure. So I'm just going to remove the action screws here. Trigger guard and floor plate. Okay. So we'll just set all this aside. Okay, so once we have that out, we're left with the barreled action and the trigger assembly. The first step here is to remove the safety. So you can see here the safety is retained by a kind of a clip. You can generally just get a small screwdriver or a pick, just push that off. There's the clip that comes off. I'm just going to stick this here in my magnetic tray so I don't lose it. Once you do that, you have this spring that's under the clip. That will lift off. Just put that here in my tray. There's a little ball bearing here that's kind of easy to lose. And there's a pin here. I'm going to push that pin out. And this pin also retains the bolt release. There's that bearing. You want to be careful not to lose that. So here's the other end of the safety pin. And that pin also retains the bolt release button. I'll stick that over here. Okay. So here's a prime example. This rifle has been sitting for about 50 years. And if you can kind of see, this old oil has turned into a varnish. See this oil here? That's almost like a varnish. It's no longer a lubricant. It's real gummy. So that just kind of shows you what can happen to the old lubricants and why these triggers have the trouble that they do. Anyhow, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the safety. And again, this is the bolt lock safety, so it has this projection on it. 1982 and after, the safeties, this is essentially removed. Okay, so at this point, trigger's still in the housing. We have 3 screws on this trigger housing. And in this video, I'm not going to really go into trigger adjustments, but the screw on the back is your sear engagement screw, and it's right here. And then you have 2 screws on the front. You have the pull weight screw, and when I got this rifle, I actually adjusted the pull weight, and I've got this. I've got that filed down, so I hope that doesn't come back to bite me. This is the overtravel screw on the top. So what I'm going to have to do now is I'm going to have to pick, see if I can get rid of the sealant. So this screw stuck out and interfered. This screw stuck out and interfered with the wood, and that's why it doesn't have the head on it anymore. I may have to let this screw alone, and I should be able to do that regardless. So what we need to do, I got the pull weight adjusted prior, a nice pull weight, but I haven't unitized the trigger on this one. So what we need to do, got a couple blocks of wood here. This is the trigger pin. This right here, this pin. And as you can see, it sticks out a little bit further. It's flush on the right hand side, the left hand side it sticks out. And that's what the bolt release button rides on. It rides on that and is retained by the other pin. So what I need to do now, I've got a couple blocks of wood here. Just going to drive that pin out. And I can do that without removing the housing. Try not to work in the shadows here. Okay, so there's the pin. I'm just going to put this pin over here. So that's what holds the trigger. And at this point, I can just pull this trigger out. And again, this feels kind of gummed up. But there you have it. There's the trigger and there's the connector. And like I explained in that previous video, this is a large portion of the problems, if not pretty much all the problems with the Remington trigger. So I got the connector out, got the trigger out. The trigger weight screw should still be in position there. I'm just going to look real quick. Yep, it's still in there. So I'm not going to have to mess with the trigger weight screw. Got the trigger weight screw still in there, so we're good to go. I'm not going to have to mess with the trigger screw that I have previously adjusted. So I'm just going to set that aside. So at this point, here's the issue. Trigger connector. And what I'm going to do is, yeah, you can kind of see that old lubricant in there. It almost turned into, it almost turns into a varnish. So before I put this back together, I'll clean this housing up with some Kroil. Kroil is my favorite real thin penetrating lubricant. if you look real close here, see that little shiny spot on the back of the trigger? Right there. That little shiny spot is where the overtravel screw. No, I'm not the overtravel screw. The overtravel screws at the front. It's where the sear engagement screw engages the trigger. So the screw right here, as you turn that screw, that allows this trigger to rotate in relation to the sear, or as Remington calls it, the safety cam. So there's our two parts. At this point, I'm going to throw on my safety glasses. I've got my Dremel right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rough up these surfaces a little bit. You'll see as I hit this with the Dremel, this connector is hardened steel and the sparks really fly. But what I'm looking to do is just kind of rough it up a little bit so that the epoxy might have something to stick to. And I don't want to go overboard with this. I don't want to change the relation or the way it would set on the trigger. I'm just looking to rough that up a little bit. Just kind of trying to give some area for the epoxy to grab. So I did that. I'm going to do the same thing to the trigger. And again, I'm just kind of roughing this up. You see the trigger's mild steel. It doesn't throw sparks. It's just a lot softer. So there we go. It doesn't take much. Got the connector roughed up, got the trigger roughed up. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up some epoxy, and I'll once I get the epoxy mixed up, I'll show you the next step. All right, so off camera, I actually cleaned up the trigger and the connector using 91% alcohol. I cleaned it up good, got all that varnish off, the trigger and the connector, and I mixed up a small quantity of epoxy. In my opinion, it's not really critical what epoxy you use. I just generally use whatever glass bedding compound I have around. Lately, I've been using a lot of this ProBed 2000. It's kind of my new favorite bedding compound, so just got a small amount of that. One of my favorite ways to mix up just small quantities of epoxy is I just use the end of a whatever canned goods I have in the cupboard. I'll just grab a can and mix up it's just a nice hard small surface to mix up some epoxy. So that's what I got here. Mixed up a small quantity. So at this point, I'm just going to apply some epoxy to my trigger. And it takes very little. The majority of what I put on here is just going to smash out when I put the connector on. But that's okay. I just want to make sure you get on the top surface of the trigger, as well as the front, and then down here at the bottom. The main thing this epoxy does, I'm sure it does a pretty good job of holding the connector in place, but I don't rely on epoxy. I drill and tap for a screw, which I'll show that process once this epoxy sets. The main thing this epoxy does is just hold everything in proper relationship so that when I drill and tap it, the screw goes in the right location and the connector doesn't shift. All right, so at this point, I'm just going to stick the connector. Onto the front of the trigger, like so. And you want to smash it on there. And there's obviously a lot of a lot of epoxy oozing out, then that's fine. I'll just clean up the bulk of the excess. It's not critical to get every last bit. After this epoxy hardens, you can always remove it with a bit of sandpaper or something. So there. Yeah, get another one here. So I got the bulk of the epoxy off. Now the main thing is, I mean, this takes several hours to set up. You want to make sure that this connector is nice and centered on that trigger. So you want to make sure that it's where you want it to be prior to allowing it to cure. So I generally take a little bit of time and make sure that it's right where it should be. And it'll kind of squirt around, so you put some pressure on it to make sure it's nice and tight. But then you want to look at it, and the critical, I mean, it's all critical, you want it to be centered on the trigger. You want the connector to be nice and centered on the trigger. But it's critical, the top edge, because that's where it interfaces with the sear. Or as Remington calls it, the safety cam. So I'm going to use my flashlight here. And just make sure that that connector is where I want it to be. So it looks good. Once you're happy with where it's at, you need to put this someplace where it's not going to get bumped. I'm going to stick it right here on the edge of my magnetic tray, and it should be safe there. Okay, so one other thing that I'll show real quick, I'll do it now while I'm thinking about it. So I'll show putting a screw through this hole. That'll be a little further on. But when you do that, when you do this unitized trigger, and I covered this in my previous video, this upper screw here is the overtravel screw. And at the end of the overtravel screw, there's a little nipple. That nipple goes through this hole on the connector. And that nipple contacts the trigger, and that's what limits your overtravel on the trigger. That overtravel screw has a nipple to go through that hole. When you unitize the connector and the trigger, as I'm doing, that nipple no longer will go through that hole. So you'll still have overtravel adjustment, but we need to get rid of the nipple on that screw. The easy way to do this without taking the housing apart. Now, if I would take this overtravel screw out, what would happen is sitting on top of that overtravel screw is a spring. So the spring sets right in here, and that's your sear spring, or as Remington calls it, the safety cam. There's a spring sets right in here. So if I take that screw completely out to remove that nipple, what's going to happen is that spring's going to come down, and I won't be able to get that screw back out or get that screw back into the hole unless I take the trigger housing off and essentially tear the whole thing apart. So I've done it that way, but lately when I do this, I just leave that overtravel screw in place, and what I do is I just get a punch, and this is something I really can't show on camera, because it's so hard to see, but it's inside of here. And essentially I'm going to put a punch on that nipple. There's a little nipple sticks out. I'm going to stick my punch on that nipple on that overtravel screw. So my punch is right in there. It's setting on that nipple. Now it usually takes one wrap and that nipple breaks off. Okay, I think that worked. Yep, nipple broke off. I can see it down in there. So at this point, the critical thing is that you actually get that nipple out of there, because you obviously don't want it floating around. You don't want your nipple floating around in the trigger mechanism. So it's broken off. It broke off flush, so that's great. So now I just got to get that little broken piece out of there. So turn this over. There it is. So right there's the little nipple. And that's what goes through the trigger connector on a stock unmodified trigger. That nipple goes through the hole in the connector to contact the trigger. But we're not going to need that anymore. So broke the nipple off. So we're good. Once this trigger sets up, the epoxy cures. I'll show my procedure for drilling and tapping and installing the screw into that. So here I have the trigger and the connector that I epoxied. Epoxy is cured. So the next step, I have a 3/32 drill bit. And you can tell if I put the shank of the drill bit in this hole, it's just about a perfect fit for that hole, the hole in the connector. And again, this connector is hard steel, so your drill bit's not really going to touch it. So what I do is I use this 3/32 drill bit to remove the epoxy. There's a little bit of epoxy in the hole. So remove the epoxy, and I just dimple the trigger enough so that when I use the smaller drill bit, it's centered in the hole. So I'm going to go ahead and chuck my 3/32 drill bit in the press here. And I've done this with a hand drill. Back before I had a drill press, I've done a trigger or two in a hand drill, but and it works if you're good at eyeballing, plumb. But the drill press makes it a lot nicer. So plug my press in here. Okay. So again, I'm just gonna run this down a little bit. There, you can get rid of the epoxy. And I just want to dimple the trigger. Okay. That way, when I drill with the smaller bit, it will be centered. So this is a number 45 drill bit. This is a wire gauge size 45. And this is the correct size for a 356 tapped hole. And the reason it's important to have the hole nice and centered is this connector's so hard, and if your hole was off center, you'd most likely break your tap when you try to tap that hole. So with the number 45 bit, I'm just going to go ahead and drill this hole. I'm just going to go ahead and drill this hole the rest of the way through the trigger. All right. So the next step is we're going to tap this hole, 356 tap. But there you can see, got a hole right through the trigger. It came out nice and centered on the backside. So, all right, that's all there is to drilling it. Next thing, we're going to tap the hole. All right, so I have my trigger drilled. Next step is tapping it. So I have a 356 tap here. This is the screw I'm going to end up using. I bought a bulk pack of these probably a decade ago from Brownells. But that's a 356 screw. So at this point I'm just going to put a little lube on the tap. I don't know if ballast is the best or not, but it should work for doing this. If you've never done any tapping, it's kind of important to kind of go easy at first. Make sure you're kind of lined up straight. Just take your time. Make sure that you're going into the hole lined up. It's really not rocket science. Especially in milder steel, which this trigger is. Trigger's fairly mild steel. So. And I'm just gonna try not to force it. You can kind of go back once in a while, clear the chips out. With a tap this small, it wouldn't be too difficult to break it. There we go. See the tap going out the back of the trigger. So we have our hole tapped. So the next step is, I'm going to clean that hole out good with some rubbing alcohol, 91%. You want to get the oil out of that hole so that the epoxy sticks. And I use epoxy on the screw as well, just so I never have to worry about that screw wanting to back out. There we go. Our trigger is now tapped. All right, so have my my unitized trigger here drilled and tapped for the screw. I have a little bit of epoxy mixed up here. So before I put the screw in here, I'm just going to degrease it. And alcohol works pretty good for this. I'm just going to use some alcohol to degrease the screw as well as the hole. And that's just so that the epoxy bonds correctly. This is all probably way overkill, but I don't want to have to ever think about the screw working loose out of the trigger. So that's why I epoxy it in place. You can see some of the grease that came off that screw, some of the preservative oil. So, and I just have some toilet tissue here. I'll show you what I do here in a bit. There may be better ways to degrease a small hole, but this has worked pretty good for me. All right, so we got our screw degreased. I'll just set that aside. Now what I've done for these holes, I just kind of end up twisting some tissue like so. And this has worked pretty good in the past. So there's a few times I've had the paper kind of break off in the hole, but you get some toilet paper soaked in 91% alcohol. You can see I'm just threading it right through the hole. See how that's bringing oil and chips out of the hole. It actually does a pretty good job of cleaning out a small hole like this. So if you're ever looking at a way of degreasing, you see all that crap coming out of that hole that I tapped, oil, and yeah, it might be about the limit. I have a feeling this is going to come loose inside. Yeah, it's working. So there we go. Got the hole degreased. Got our screw degreased. So at this point, I already have some epoxy mixed up. I'm just going to work some epoxy into that hole. And I'm sure some red Loctite would be more than sufficient for this as well. I've always just used epoxy. This is a screw that will never come out. In fact, after the screw's installed and the epoxy dries, I actually sand down, take the belt sander and just hit it real quick on the belt sander, and actually get rid of the head on the screw. Not the entire head. I leave a button, but I get rid of the slot portion of the screw. So got epoxy coming out of the back. Just set that aside. Go ahead and, just for good measure, I'm going to put some epoxy on the screw threads as well. And again, this is so I never have to worry about this screw working out. Okay. Okay, screws nice and tight. I'm just going to remove the excess epoxy around the screw head. So, once this epoxy cures, what I'll do is I'll cut off the excess screw sticking out the backside, and I'll take and remove the slotted portion of the head so that it just leaves a button remaining. But we'll cover that once the epoxy cures. So continuing on with our fixing the Remington 700 trigger problem, the last we did is we set this screw in epoxy in the trigger here. So we drilled, tapped the trigger for the 356 screw. We have the screw in. So now that the epoxy is cured, I'm going to trim the tail off this screw, and I'm also going to kind of remove the slot in the screw head and just leave a button. Just leave a button there. So I'm just going to use a cutoff wheel and a Dremel. I've done this. I've done the front part, removing the slot on a belt sander as well. Either way works. What I try to avoid doing is getting it too hot and melting the epoxy that is actually bonding the screw in. So that's what we'll do right now. I'm just going to trim that screw off, clean that up a little bit. And I want to be careful not to get this Dremel into the sear surface. And what I mean by that is the top edge of the connector here, right where the screwdriver is. You don't want to mess with that surface. That's very hard steel, but the cutting wheel could definitely booger that up if you aren't careful. So there, I got rid of the tail of the screw. At this point, I'm just going to kind of convert the head of the screw into a little button. And the main reason for doing this is so that the trigger has more travel forward until it hits the overtravel screw. By working this screw down a little bit, it doesn't take much. But, that's enough. You can see it still has a trace of the slot there, but you have a nice button sticking off the front. And so now what I'm going to do is I have a stone here. It works pretty good, but I also have some 400 grit sandpaper. So I'm just going to put the stone makes a nice backing for the sandpaper. I'm just gonna kind of polish that up a little bit. Get the front of that screw nice and polished. Not really polished, but smooth surface for it to contact the overtravel screw. It's looking pretty good. I might just hit it on the stone to kind of finish it up. So yeah, I'm happy with that. As you can see, it just kind of leaves a button there. Still a little trace of the slot, but what we end up with is a nice flat button. So there we have it. We have the connector epoxied and screwed, and the screws set in epoxy as well. So that's permanently bonded. The next step is when you glue these on, you'll probably find there's traces of epoxy on the side faces. So what I generally do is I clean that up as well, and I'll just kind of use the same method here. Just run the sides. Just run the sides of that. Clean up any epoxy that might be sticking off, any high areas. So that looks pretty good to me. There are triggers ready to, should be ready to stick back in the trigger mechanism. Test fit it here. Maybe not quite. It looks like it's going to have a little drag. So what that means is I got to work it down a little bit more. So just kind of going a little bit at a time. You definitely don't want it to be tight in the trigger mechanism. So sometimes, as you can see here, sometimes when you drill and tap that screw, it actually can swell out the sides of the trigger slightly. So that's what you're seeing there. You're seeing kind of a bright spot where through the tapping process, the metal was actually pushed out. Again, the trigger is soft metal. The trigger is soft. So that's what's going on there. That line shows where the tap kind of displaced some metal. So we got a little bit more to remove. And pretty much every trigger I've done this to. I think the tolerances in the housing are a little bit different. I've had to take maybe more material off of some triggers and less off of others, but generally it doesn't take much. So you can see we're already getting more of the trigger than just that high spot. It wasn't much of a high spot, but when you're on a perfectly flat, smooth surface like this, it really accentuates. It really shows you the unevenness. So that high spot might have only been a thousandth of an inch or two, but so there you can see we're getting that smoothed up. We'll work a little more off this side. Some of them might also be some epoxy oozed out. Okay, let's see where we're at. Well, seems like we're there. But we want to make sure there's no drag on it. I'm against my overtravel screw. See, it's kind of. I think I might take just work it a little bit more yet. I think it would have been fine there, but. And you could use most anything that has a nice flat edge on it for this. Just stone works well, but nice flat piece of glass or something like that would work as well. Okay, I'm definitely happy with that. So I don't have the pin in yet, but you can see the trigger's just floating in there, nice and easy. That's what you want to see. You don't want to see that trigger binding up in the housing. So I'd say we're good. You can see there how much I polished off. Just get the sides nice and smooth. Get rid of any epoxy that might have seeped out from this joint. So yeah, looks like that's going to work well. I'm just going to clean this trigger up with a little bit of Croil. Croil is one of my, I use it a lot, especially for trigger mechanisms, because it's really thin and no danger of it getting thick or varnishing from my experience. So just clean the sanding grit and dust off before we stick this trigger back in the housing. That looks good. Okay, so we are ready for our reassembly of our trigger housing. So what we want to do, we want to get our trigger put up in here. And I'm just going to use an appropriate size wooden block here. Kind of set this on. I'm going to line up the trigger. Just going to line up that hole for the trigger pin. I've got my trigger pin right here. Sometimes when you look at these, you can kind of tell which end was which. In my experience, it really doesn't matter. Generally, it seems like the far hole in the housing is tighter than the near, but get the trigger pin started there. I'm just going to start it. Okay, so trigger pin started through the trigger. See, the trigger's nice and loose. So here's something when you're doing this. You want the pin to just be flush with the right hand side of the housing. You want the pin to stick out on this side, and that's what your bolt release lever rides on. So let's see where we're at. And it's just under flush. So I'm going to give it another whack or two. Probably going to work. Yep, I think that's where we want it. So it's flush on the right hand side. It's still projecting from the left hand side. And you can see we got nice free trigger movement there, no drag. Okay, so at this point, I am going to reassemble the rest of the trigger assembly. This is our bolt stop release lever. And like I showed when I disassembled it, it's got some old varnish in there. That's old factory lubricant from 50 years ago. This is 1974 700. So before I put that in, I'm actually going to wipe that with some Croil. Let's get rid of that varnish while we're in here. There you can see how it's coming off on the rag. Again, this old gummed up varnished lubricant, that in conjunction with the floating connector, that's a big part. It's a big part of the Remington trigger problem. This side doesn't look varnished up too bad, but we'll hit it as well. Okay, you got rid of that old varnish. So this rides right on here like this. The top end goes on the little notch in the bolt catch. So at this point, we're ready for our safety. There goes the little ball. Luckily, I watched where it rolled. Okay. I think our safety has a little bit of varnish on it as well. Okay. So the safety is going to go back right in like so. And our safety pivot pin goes through. Well, I'm not sure why it's not lining up for me. There it goes. It's just a little bit of a tight fit. So there we go. We got the safety pivot pin in. You can see the safety works nice and easy. We'll test our bolt release. It works. Again, there's some old varnish on that bolt release as well. So again, that's just old lubricant. I'm not sure what Remington used 50 years ago for assembly lube or preservative, but it's obvious it kind of turns to a varnish over time. So, and a lot of lubricants will do that. So that works properly, as we can see. Oh, my pin's working out. Push it back in. That's working. Our safety's working. Okay, so at this point, we are ready to drop the little detent ball into the hole. It goes in the hole in the safety. Next goes our spring. Here's our spring. Later versions of this spring, actually, see that little dimple right there, tip of my thumb? The later versions actually have two of those, which I prefer. I'll probably just stick this one back in. I might have a later version laying somewhere, but I'll just stick this one in because that's what I got on hand. I'll show you in a minute what that little dimple is for. All right, so this spring, it's kind of it's a spring for the detent ball. Those little legs go over the arm of the safety, like so. And it sets on there just like that. So the next thing we need is our detent, or no, not a detent. This is our E-clip, our little clip mechanism. And this can be a little tricky. But generally, you want to get it started. And then use the screwdriver without stabbing yourself through the thumb. You got to get that clip back in position. All right, so the clip is on the pin, but it's still not in the correct position. We've got to make sure it's down in the groove, and we have to make sure that it's spun so that that little nipple there, for lack of a better term, that little projection is in this portion of the clip, and that's designed to keep the clip from spinning. So we're going to push this around. Like so. I don't think my clip is quite where it needs to be. I can tell because the safety, it's not snapping positively. So you want to make sure you get a good snap out of that safety. I think this clip needs to be pushed down. There, I think we got it. Did you hear that snap into place? There we go. That's how it should be. Nice positive snap in both positions. That clip wasn't completely down on that axle. So how I did that is I set the head of the pin on a hard surface and pushed downwards with my screwdriver. Okay, so that pin is nice and seated. Pin is seated, and our bolt release works. Okay, so our trigger is now essentially reassembled, with the exception of the pull weight adjustment screw. So in the last video, I showed how I had previously ground the head off my trigger adjustment screw and sealed it. I just decided, since I was doing this, that I was going to go ahead and kind of start over and work this trigger. So we're going to throw the trigger spring back in, the trigger weight adjustment screw. We'll safety check this rifle for sear engagement, and then we'll put it back together. So what I have here is I have a small spring, and this came out of just a kind of a assortment of small springs I got from Wolf Gun Spring, and that's what I got here. It's a fair bit lighter than the Remington factory spring, and it allows me to kind of get the pull weight down where I want it easier than the Remington factory springs. So I'm just going to stick that in here. It goes in there. I'm going to put a drop of red Loctite on this. You want to be careful because this red Loctite does act quick, and I kind of already know where this screw was, so I'm just going to put it back in essentially where it was. But if I'm not really making a trigger adjustment video here, but if you're playing with trigger adjustment, you don't want to put this red Loctite on too quick, because it will set up quicker than maybe what you're ready when you're adjusting a trigger. So this trigger was kind of right around, this had right around a 3-pound trigger pull, which was about what I want for a, you know, a general purpose hunting rifle that might be used in cold weather. You don't want too light of a pull, especially if you have gloves on. At least that's my thought process. So what you want to make sure of, you do want to make sure that there's, I will cover that, you want to make sure that there's spring tension on the trigger. I mean, that's a necessity. So I have that trigger screw set about where it was, got tension on the trigger. That should give me about a 3-pound pull is what I had on this rifle. So safety works. Now I haven't messed any with the sear engagement screw. I don't think I'm going to have to mess with the sear engagement, but I have had to adjust the sear engagement before when I've unitized the trigger. So it certainly is possible. I'm going to throw the scale on it here and see where we're at. He said I'm looking for about a 3-pound pull. As far as I know, this rifle's unfired. It looks that way. I'm not honestly sure at this point whether I'll shoot it. Probably will. But if I do, it'll be a general purpose hunting rifle. So we got 2 pounds, 2.5. Yeah, it broke at 2 3/4 pounds. So a 2 3/4 pound trigger pull there. Doesn't seem like there's any. Any creep that I can tell. I'm gonna stick it in my stock here. Again, use this. I just have this plastic stock laying around so I don't have to pull it in and out of the bedded stock when I'm working on triggers. And this is a good thing to check after you do trigger work. So I'm just going to check the sear engagement. Balance that pipe. Make sure the trigger doesn't drop. So that's a good safety check for sear engagement. Looks like the sear is holding. We've got a nice pull. Probably 2 3/4, 3 pounds. So I think I'm happy with that. Okay. So we got our trigger screw in place. The final step that I'm going to do here is I'm going to adjust the overtravel. I backed and that's this top screw. I backed the overtravel screw off after I broke the nipple. I broke the nipple off of the punch and then I backed it off. So you can see, if you look in this hole right here, you can see as I pull that trigger, there's a fair bit of extra trigger movement beyond where the sear would break. So here's your sear, and then here's your trigger. So you can see the trigger is moving a fair bit beyond. And I was never one to really think that getting a real tight overtravel was critical, at least in my liking. I think sear engagement and creep is more important than overtravel, but I'm going to adjust that overtravel up a little bit. think I put a dab of Loctite on that as well. I'm going to find the tip. It's got a fine slot in it. Alright, that one doesn't fit it. There we go. So I'm just backing that out a little bit. That slot is still plugged with some sealant. There we go. There we go. Now I should be able to get something done. Okay. So I want to be careful not to back that out too much because the sear spring sits on top of that screw. So if you take that screw the whole way out, then you're going to have to take the trigger assembly apart because there's a spring in there for the sear. So I'm just going to put a drop of Loctite on there. And I'm just going to run that screw in. We'll go in a little ways. I'm going to remove the excess. We're just going to see where we're at. That's probably about right. I could tighten it up some more, but as you can see there, the trigger is somewhat limited after it passes the sear. So I think I'm happy with that adjustment. Again, I'm really not trying to make a trigger adjustment video. If you're not sure what you're doing with trigger adjustment, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. But this is some of the things I look for. I could get some more overtravel out of that, but I'm happy with that. So just try a trigger break here. We just want to work that bolt briskly, make sure it doesn't jump the sear. So I adjusted the overtravel. I got the trigger weight screw in there. I haven't done anything on this trigger with the sear engagement. So it's holding when I work the bolt briskly. I'm going to place it back in this stock. I'm just going to bounce it on the floor again. So the sear held. I'm happy with that sear engagement. I'm gonna check the trigger pull weight one more time before that red Loctite sets up. I got a pound, 2 pounds, 2.5. Yep, broke right at 3 pounds. So I'm happy with that. For this rifle, I think that's where I want it. So there we are. At this point, we are ready to reassemble the rifle. So, I'm just going to grab the magazine box and stick it in here. Yep, that will happen. Slide that in there. I actually glass bedded the recoil lug of this action while the rifle's apart. So I slipped the follower and the spring out of the floor plate just so it was not in my way when I was bedding the rifle. So snap that back in there. There we go. Now the important thing on these BDLs is to make sure the inside of this bottom metal has like a little lip that the magazine box has to fit into. That would be right here. You just want to make sure that that magazine box is properly seated in that lip before you start installing the action screws and torquing them down. So that's properly in there. Short screw goes to the front. The long screw goes to the rear. You got to be careful with these slotted screwdrivers. I like slotted screws because they're more traditional, but you have to be careful because your screwdriver can easily slip out of them and scratch your stock. Okay. Function test it. All right. So the only thing left to do is I'm going to torque these action screws. I think for a wood stock like this, I'll probably just go to 35 inch-pounds. So it starts at 10, not 0. So it's 20, it's 30, 35. We'll give her 35 inch-pounds. Okay, there we go. Completed the trigger project. So I hope that answers some questions for those of you out there that kind of commented on my first video, the procedure of doing this. It's something I do to all my 700s that I hunt with, or at least big game. I do have one that's specifically for targets and varmints that I haven't done this with. But that rifle in particular, I haven't swapped the safety either, so the bolt doesn't lock shut with the safety on. But other than that, all my serious hunting 700s, I've done this too. My favorite aftermarket trigger is the Schillen. I do have a Schillen trigger and a 700 clone. It's a board and timberline action. I do like the Schillen triggers as well, and the big reason I like the Schillen trigger is you can use, in fact they require the Remington safeties, and I use the bolt lock Remington 700 safety with the Schillen trigger. That way I can still have the bolt lock feature, and Schillen makes a really nice trigger. But for most of my Remington 700 hunting rifles, I just do what I just laid out here. You can get a pretty nice trigger pull with a minimum of expenditure, and it solves the major problem that the Remington 700 triggers have. So anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, post them up.